us home about death and glory. I feel tired and alone. Try to keep my heart warm and free, but my soul is feeling lonely, as much as it could be. My eyes are no tired of sleeping, even I feel too tired to be.
Hello, my name's Kate Mason, and today I am talking to Mark Sutherland, who wrote this very, very interesting book, Exterminating Poverty, the true story of the eugenic plan to get rid of the poor and the Scottish doctor who fought against it. And I came across Mark a few months ago. Mark lives not very far from me. He's in Sydney. And I've always been really wanting to get the time to be able to look at eugenics and the history of eugenics in Australia. So I was really interested when I saw that Mark had written this book. So welcome, and thank you for coming on to talk to me more about your book.
Thank you, Kate.
Okay, so just in a nutshell, if we can go through a bit of the book. This is your grandfather.
Yes.
And he was a doctor in England, and it's a case between Marie Stopes.
There's a couple of organisations. The one that's named after her is MSI, Reproductive Choices, formerly known as Marie Stopes International. In the United States, which is more associated with Sanger, Margaret Sanger, her American counterpart. That's the American one. But there are a lot of connections between the two organisations and support between each other and things like that.
Yeah, so it's birth control and abortions primarily, I understand.
That's correct, yeah.
So can we start right at the beginning? Because my understanding is it was only later in life that you came to understand the full history and understanding about your grandfather in this court case, and that for quite a long time you understood something else. So what did you know about your grandfather, and what did you think about this court case prior?
I knew he was been a famous author. I knew that he'd met heads of states from time to time. I knew that at some stage I learned that he'd been in a big controversial case with Marie Stopes in the 1920s. And she being a very, very public figure, all the information came from her source. And she was one of the sort of, Britain's Margaret Sanger. So she was one of the bright lights. And so it was like learning about that case. It turned out that it would appear that he attacked one of the saints of birth control. Now, birth control in the sort of current era means pretty much contraceptives. And then as I came to learn it, so pretty much I didn't know that any of the other things were involved in it, such as abortion or eugenics or Malthusianism. Now, the other thing was, I didn't know the truth about the story. Nobody, family or otherwise, told me otherwise. Now, there are partly reasons for that, partly because of the age I was. And the other thing is that, I sort of wouldn't go and ask my father about cervical caps while he was eating his cornflakes in the morning. So, there were a number of reasons, but certainly family didn't know. And if I spoke to people about it, there was a sort of feeling of, oh, well, he lost the historical argument because contraceptives are everywhere. And so it was just contraceptives he was against. And the other thing, there was a bit of embarrassment about it. I perceived that, why was he so angry against a woman who set up a family planning clinic, and look at her name today, Yeah. What a lost cause that was.
And so how did you come across that there was a very different story behind the court case?
I found a cellar. I tripped over a cellar containing all of his papers, and I came across his papers, came across a speech back in 1917 he made called Consumption, Its Cause and Cure. And, you know, I'd like to really get across, it wasn't just in one afternoon of, aha, here's the answer. But I came across 2 reports. He was a tuberculosis specialist and was the medical officer of the St. Marylebone dispensary for the prevention of consumption. And I had to learn that consumption was tuberculosis of the lungs. I had to learn that tuberculosis was a huge problem then. It was called the White Plague. And consumption tuberculosis of the lungs killed 150,000 in the British Isles every year. It killed 70,000 in Britain every single year. It disabled 150,000 people every year. And any time that the breadwinner of the family was struck down with the disease, whole families would go into, you know, they'd end up in the poorhouse, they'd go into poverty and things like that. And so it was sort of pieced together very, very slowly. But what I eventually learned was that he was a tuberculosis specialist. Mainstream eugenists at the time perceived that tuberculosis was an inherited disease. Yeah, they knew germs were involved, but they said it's primarily inherited. And you had Sir James Barr, who was the head of the British Medical Association in 1912, saying, look, you know, if we get rid of this disease, we're going to have a nation of hothouse plants that won't survive in any particular environment. And so we don't want these people to survive. Another fellow who called Carl Pearson, who was the first professor of eugenics at University College London, he effectively said in the 1911 or thereabouts, he said, look, the fact is that, you know, the tuberculous are effectively the people with tuberculosis, and the way to cure this disease is to let nature take its course. And in other words, these fellows are going to die, and so we let that happen. We get rid of the disease. That then I had to make the link to Stopes, and I say I had to make the link to Stopes. As I say, it was a thing of threading it together, and then by chance finding out a link between Dr. Sutherland and Sir James Barr. So in 1912, Sir James Barr makes that hothouse plant speech and compares the people with tuberculosis as the weeds and, you know, the effect on the empire. I then managed to find an article written a few months after that in November 1912 called Consumption, the Soil and the Seed in Consumption in the British Medical Journal, in which Dr. Halliday Southerland attacks Barr's speech. And it's a direct attack because he uses the same language, he uses the same metaphors and things like that. And what he effectively says is, look, I used to believe that tuberculosis was primarily an inherited disease. However, I've now come to the view that it's primarily caused by infection. And it's a disease that if we catch it, well, we can cure it. And if we catch it early enough, we can prevent, you know, we can cure it entirely. And that's what we need to do. Then there was the First World War, and that really, really heightened eugenic concerns. And it did it for a number of reasons. One is that the men turning up to the recruiting stations in the big British industrial cities, when they were inspected, it just showed how the poor physical and mental condition of the working classes and the poor. They were categorized into A1, which was, you know, the designation A1 meant that you could serve anywhere in the British Empire as it then was, fit for service anywhere. And then 1 was the physical condition you're in. And then there were the C3s who, for home duties only and not very good physical condition, and possibly even unfit to serve. And there were lots of C3s. And I mention that terminology because that's when those phrases came into the lexicon. The other reason it caused a problem was that prior to the war, the eugenicists were really, really worried about the thing they called the differential birth rate. And that was the fact that Britain's population doubled between 1800 and 1880. It's doubled. And then in the mid-1880s, it's began to fall. But the fall wasn't even across all levels of society. And, you know, the upper classes and middle classes were having fewer children, but the working classes were not. And so a eugenist at the time would have said, well, this is a real problem because breeding is all. And the fact is, we are breeding 1/2 of our next generation from what they called the worst stocks, the lowest quarter of this generation. And they fretted about race suicide and racial degeneration, and this seemed to confirm it. So while in the First World War, all of the C3s are at home, safe, and not being removed from the gene pool, you've got all of the A1s getting slaughtered in the trenches.
And the C3s procreating at home.
Absolutely, yeah. And so this was just going to be disastrous to the British Empire. And so then I found that Dr. Sutherland had spoken out, as I mentioned in that speech in the suitcase, Consumption, Its Cause and Cure, in which he attacked the eugenists. And he said, look, we can cure tuberculosis and we just need to put the effort into it. But he was attacking, he was pretty, it's quite an angry speech. It's not intemperate, but it's quite angry because he says, look, you know, there are 10,000 children who are dying every year of tuberculosis. And people say, oh, what can be done? But he said, it's no more natural they're dying of tuberculosis than if we poisoned their milk with arsenic. We're not sorting out the milk. And he points out that in the United States at the time, what's happening is they're sorting out milk according to the end user. And so, you know, if you've got people like young children or the very old, they get the purest milk. And then the knockabout people in the best of their health, they get the stuff that might have the tuberculosis in it, as far as purification. Likewise, they could have pasteurized the milk at that stage. A royal commission had made the recommendation over 10 years before, but nothing had been done. And so he was sort of saying, you know, there's no point moaning about this disease if you're not going to do something about it. And then specifically, and this is where my co-author, Neil Sutherland, brought this to my attention. He said, do you know there's a reference to eugenics there? I said, no. And he drew it to my attention. Basically, Dr. Sutherland said, look, there are a lot of people who think the efficiency of the state is be all and end all. He said this war, they talk about the survival of the fittest, but this war has made a mockery of them because who thinks he's fit because he survives? You know, it's nonsense. He said, by treating people with tuberculosis, I'm not preserving the unfit and the sick. We are conserving or preserving the poor. And if we don't do that, then you'll get a young child dying, and then when they get into their teens, they're going to die, or they're going to die as a young adult. You've got to do something about it. Almost there. A year later, Sir James Barr makes another speech on the future of the medical profession, in which he lays it out. He says, again, about the hothouse flowers. But then he says, look, it's quite obvious that except to the people who have been blinded by sentiment, referring to people like Dr. Sutherland, that, you know, tuberculosis is a friend of the race. And this is pretty accurate. This bit I'm going to quote is, it is a rough, but on the whole, very effective check upon the unfit and kills them before they can procreate. There are about 150,000 idiots in this country. And when you look at their families, their families are only a shade better. And then he says, if tuberculosis was to disappear from these islands, it would be nothing short of a national calamity. We're not ready for its disappearance until there is a check on the marriage of undesirables. So then, that's 1918. You then go forward to 1921. you get Dr. Marie Stopes, a doctor of science, not of medicine. Dr. Marie Stopes opens her mother's clinic in a poor part of London. And what then happens is you have Sir James Barr is invited to go to her great rally at the Queen's Hall. He's invited, he's not able to do that. And he's invited to become a vice president of her society, the Society for Constructive Birth Control and Racial Progress. So he becomes a vice president. He can't attend the Queen's Hall speech, so he writes her a letter in which he says, you and your husband, Humphrey Roe, have inaugurated a movement with which we will, actually I better quote it so I get it right. You have inaugurated a great movement in which I eventually hope to get rid of our C3 population and exterminate poverty. The only way to raise an A1 population is to breed them. And so eugenics was hook, line, and sinker at the center of her movement. And people like Sir James Barr, who supported eugenics, people like Bertrand Russell and people, H.G. Wells, were also vice presidents of her society, and other supporters involved people like George Bernard Shaw, who was also a eugenist, although he wasn't a vice president. Mm. And so what it became very, very clear was, well, hang on, all of the stories on this side have been written by the biographers of Stopes. It's time to level it up a bit. To begin with, I started to contact people who had written articles, and I said, look, you might be interested in this paper, or, you know, I've done this research and found this. And I thought they're going to be, wow, great, this takes the story and makes it more interesting. And I didn't hear back. And that's when I realized I'd have to write a book about it and get the story out there and cement it. Because the way things were, if I popped my clogs, without being too melodramatic about it, but if I went under the bus or whatever like that, the story would have remained where it was, and he would have, you know, been blamed for something. Whereas, in fact, I believe people should say, well, he made a principled stand. You may not agree with his views on contraceptives or abortion, etc., but wasn't he brave to stand up to eugenics?
Absolutely, because there's quite a lot of disturbing quotes that you put in from the time, and it was just, I mean, I'm not sure it was was it mainstream? I mean, it was professionals talking in this particular way. And as you said about how classing people into whether or not they're war ready and you know, lamenting the fact there's so many of these, you know, C3 people in the world, in England. It's quite extraordinary, some of the quotes that are in there, that obviously people weren't ashamed, or it wasn't embarrassing or shameful to say these sorts of things.
Yeah. And in fairness to them, while there was a bit of venom behind it when people referred to idiots, for instance, it should be noted that there were categories of people. And if the people watching this conversation are wondering what the categories are, the next time somebody cuts in on the road to you, just note what you say to them. If you call them a moron, an imbecile, and an idiot, you're actually quoting the categories, the scientific categories that the eugenists came up with to describe particular people, and they're still in use today.
I think there's a lot of language and phrasing that's still in use today from that era.
Yeah.
A lot of sentiment that is like that, because it comes into the population concerns as well, that language.
Yes.
Yeah. And so you've made it clear that this is all comes from a survival of the fittest mentality, a Darwin understanding of survival of the fittest, and then comes out of there at some point.
Yes.
Is that what you would say? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Mm. And the link is started with Malthus in the 1700s, this treatise on population, and there's competition for resources. And as that population will always increase beyond the capacity of the land to support them, and therefore it's going to end in war, famine, and disease. Darwin is then inspired to write Of Origin of the Species, and then because of the competition of all these species on the planet, so then that's founded, and then so he writes that book, and then his cousin Sir Francis Galton thinks about Darwin's work, and he's inspired to coin eugenics in its modern phase. He calls his new science eugenics, based on the Greek for good and breeding, or good and inheritance, and genics. And then he calls eugenics the science by which you can look at all of the agencies under our control, by which you can improve, or I forget the word he used, but the opposite of improve, the people in our society and inherited. And in a book called Can't Say Where, you saw how intensely he went into it. I mean, he was thinking that was going to be the national religion of keeping the gene pool going, and sort of came up with ideas that, marriages would be arranged and that there would be subsidies given to the eugenically good. Have you ever heard of Pear's soap?
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't seen it for some time, and I haven't seen it since I was in Britain. But Pear's soap, if you go back into that, they used to run baby competitions. And you think that's just a marketing ploy, but actually the baby competitions were competitions as to who had the most eugenically fine family, and you get a ribbon for, being taller, stronger, more intelligent than your neighbors or whatever like that. But yeah, the thing is, I don't think they meant it nasty. I think some people did, but some people, they just used that language because that's the language that they used.
Yes. So how did the court case come about? Why did Marie Stopes sue or take your grandfather to court?
Well, he went to a talk in July. She opened her clinic on March 17th, 1921 in Holloway. He went to a talk by Professor Louise McIlroy at the Medico-Legal Society in July 1921. Professor McIlroy, who was, and this is interesting too, Stopes is the sort of female pioneer, always waved the flag for. McIlroy was also a female pioneer, very early, if not one of the first graduates of university, first professor of gynecology at London University, and practicing at the Royal Free Hospital for Women. And yet she's completely buried in history. No one's ever heard of her. But anyway, McIlroy said that the cervical cap being dispensed at Stopes's clinic, and by the way, the brand names of those were Racial Brand and Pro Race. So a bit of a eugenic thinking going on there. She said it's the most dangerous of which she'd had experience. So Halliday took that. He wrote a pamphlet for the Catholic Truth Society, and then he developed it into a book which was published, I think, in May 1922, or maybe it was in February 1922. She got the book and ignored it to begin with. And I take the fact that she ignored it from her husband, Humphrey Rowe's witness statement. So that would have been something under oath. They just ignore it. He said it was so badly written and, didn't make any sense that they ignored it. If you look at her letters at the time, she's badgering her solicitor, because a lot of people on a lot of different sides are attacking her. There's the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church saying, we don't like this to work on contraception. You've got unscrupulous merchants, and she can't be blamed for this. But if you went into a bookshop and got her book Married Love, which would have been very advanced and risque for its time, all of a sudden you open it up and out drops a leaflet for Patterson's pills for irregularities of all sorts, which is a nod and a wink for, if you've missed your period, these things are going to sort your problem out of pregnancy, unmarried pregnancy. And so she was getting the opprobrium of those people. People were using her name in association with other things. So she's being tacked on all sides. She decided, she was badgering her solicitor about these attacks, but one of the other things too she was doing was she said, I want to attack the Catholics. And she wanted to sue a Father McNabb, I think it was. And she said, look, you need to brief the solicitor. to make him aware of the gang of ruling Catholics that run the Daily Mail, because in her eyes, there was a gang of Catholics, running everything and attacking her in the press. And so I think one of the reason Halliday came as the cab off the rank was that he wrote in the book that she was exposing the poor to experiment. He quoted McIlroy as saying, look, she's using the device which is most dangerous. And he said that, it's outrageous that, the Home Secretary allows it. And Charles Bradlaugh, a Malthusian of about 50 years before, Charles Bradlaugh went to jail for a less serious crime. And it was at that point that Stopes, having tried to start 2 or 3 or 4 cases, said, right, we've got our man, because he's a doctor. And doctors were the only people who were legitimately allowed to hand out contraceptives at that stage. So he met that bill, and he was a Catholic. So he ticked those boxes as well. And that's why they pressed ahead, despite the fact that the advice was, let it go. Don't take these people on.
So that's the start of it. And then your grandfather took it on and was able to secure some funds from the church, wasn't he? The church supported him.
Yeah. Well, that was all a bit desperate, actually, because what happened, he got the writ. He had a solicitor and a journalist sitting down with him. And they said, look, these words are defamatory. So you're either going to got 2 defenses, which are that they're fair comment. In other words, it's perfectly legitimate comment to make about something that's public, or that it's true in substance and fact. And of all of them, truth is the most difficult defense, because in trying to prove that it's true, if you get witnesses that throw even more mud at the plaintiff, you are actually loading up the damages if you make the defamation worse in the court. So it's very tricky. Halliday didn't have any money to defend the case, so he decided he was going to defend himself. His journalist friend was connected with the Catholic Church. Halliday didn't know any Catholics because this was 1922 and he'd been a Catholic since 1919. So nobody knew who he was. But the fellow makes a phone call to Westminster, the Archdiocese of Westminster, and then he gets the message back that the Archbishop, Cardinal Bourne, will support you to the end. So that was moral support. Bourne also gave £500 of his personal funds, but it was all a bit desperate. And there was a not a funny bit in the book, but there was this Catholic solicitor of his first solicitor he went to, who, Dr. Sutherland's run up a bit of a legal bill, and this Catholic solicitor in a Protestant firm hasn't called any funds in. And he's having to go to the sort of senior partner, explain why Dr. Sutherland's account's behind and why he hasn't collected funds. They then start mentioning the case to Catholics. People say, well, the Catholic, I think it was Catholic Federation, something like that. But as people are reaching for their pockets to get their checkbooks out, the head of the Catholic Federation says, there's this thing called maintenance, which is that if you support a legal suit that wouldn't have taken place, and it had nothing to do with you, and it took place because you were trying to attack your enemies, if you got involved in that, well, you're opening yourself to damages. Yeah. And so it was very desperate. It even got to the stage once where they had a meeting, and everybody came up with these ideas to raise funds. And so somebody proposed an idea, and then anybody seconded it, and it was the 2 people, the person who proposed it and his mate, and then everybody else voted against it. So it was pretty desperate. There were second collections being held in Catholic churches, and there was also support from other denominations as well. But eventually they did get over the line. Yes, they did get the support.
And do you want to sum up just in the court case? Because there were a lot of comments, a lot of quotes from Marie Stopes, which made it very clear that she had a eugenics approach to helping the poor. So, yeah, there were a lot of quotes in there. So what would you say about that court case, just to give people a bit of an idea?
Okay. Really that it went on for 5.5 days, that Stopes was using it as a platform to publicize her cause, that she was her own worst enemy. You know, she was asked brief, you know, for yes or no answers, and she kept making speeches. And so she was painted as a charitable woman helping her poorer sisters at the beginning. But, you know, she volunteered the information. No, I'm doing this because I want to stop the breeding at the wrong end of society and increase the breeding at the right end of society. And so then the jury were sort of saying, well, this is a different person to the one we've been as advertised. Yeah, and it went on for 5.5 days. The people testifying for both sides were, you know, the leading names of the medical profession at the time. And while the reader won't know their names, you know, they're sort of, one of them was the chap who invented putting metal devices into bones to help them to heal. Another fellow was the fellow who came up with discovered hormones. So the eminent names. And then it came down to a decision, and he won.
And there was a lot of talk about that particular, what was it called? The T thing that was being put in women's uterus to keep the uterus, to keep the cervix open. And there was a lot of talk about that. Yeah,
it was called the gold pin or the gold spring. I think, in fairness to Stopes, though I don't know, I think it was discovered once litigation had begun, because the writ was issued in May 1922. And then in February 1923, about 9 days before the case opened, the defendants said, okay, we want to bring up the gold spring, because Stopes had sent some women to an Australian doctor in London called Dr. Norman Hare to be fitted with the gold spring after he had told her that it was dangerous, that it'd be struck off if he was found using it. So in fairness to Stopes, that was in the litigation. But why they brought it up was, having said it was an experiment, you know, that it was experiment, Dr. Southerland testified it was a social experiment he was referring to, that you didn't know what the impact was going to be if you started distributing contraceptives to the poor. The gold spring really fitted the bill. One, because it was dangerous. One fellow described it as a barbarous instrument. Another doctor testified. Now, these are Sutherland's doctors, but they're eminent people in gynecology. And, you know, he discovered one that had become implanted in the tissue of the woman, and it was becoming infected, and that had he not removed it, it could have become very, very dangerous. And remember, these are the days before antibiotics. And so that came into it.
As well as that it could be create abortion.
Yeah, that was right. Sorry, thank you for that. That was the other point, because what was the impact? Well, some people said that because it was there, it would prevent conception. Other people said, well, it's holding the cervix open, so it's going to enhance conception. And then yet more people said, well, yes, but if conception does take place, then it's going to be an abortifacient. And so it really fitted the bill. One, because abortion was strictly by the law illegal in those days, and certainly handing out an abortifacient was frowned upon, you know, to say the least. And then secondly, well, if you're going to argue against that and say, well, it's not an abortifacient, you're going to say, well, you're saying it's not an experiment, but these doctors say this and these other doctors say that. Which is it? And so it was a great pincer movement from the defensive point of view.
So it got very close. It could have gone either way from reading the book, you know, the outcome. But your grandfather won at the end of the day. And then the book pretty much ends after that. But Marie Stopes obviously kept going and kept her family planning clinics going until they're all over the world. So that would be another history to learn about. So how was it for you finding out this completely different history and that it's not acknowledged and not written anywhere besides for your book?
Well, how was it for me? How was it for my wife and my son? And that sort of, I became obsessed with it. You know, it's like, you know, really, really wanted to get the truth out, because, you know, like when I read the speech from Sir James Barr, it was, you know, very early in the morning. I'm like effing and sitting at a desk, you know, sort of effing and jeffing and sort of, this is all wrong. And And so they come down for breakfast in the morning. Oh, I've discovered this speech. How it was for me, yeah, I really, it makes me quite angry actually. And it's so unfair because the people, people still write about Stopes and her battle today. And what they do is they sort of say, they say, well, she did all of this and this evil Dr. Sutherland did that. And she didn't, and look, I'm 100% against her eugenics. And so I'd contact these people. I'd always be polite because I didn't want to give them an excuse to brush me off. But I was always polite. But what frustrated me was, and I've made the offer on my website that there's a free T-shirt, when they acknowledge that actually they have the luxury of saying I'm against eugenics. I mean, who's going to argue with you? Who's going to argue? Oh, I think the poor should all be sterilized. Well, that's saying you're against that's not very controversial at all. When Dr. Sutherland said it, it was.
Yeah.
And yet they're saying, oh, I'm good and virtuous and I'm distancing Stopes. And it's like, well, actually, you're agreeing with Dr. Sutherland and you need to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And they just don't. So, yeah, I'm little by little, I started this research in 2013, and how it is for me, it's a labor of love, and I really want to get the story, and that's why I'm delighted, you're interested in the story.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So where can people buy the book from?
On Amazon. And can I just pick up the sort of link between Marie Stopes or MSI Reproductive Choices and today? At the end of the book, I make it very clear that post-19, if you say eugenics to people today, they go, well, that's something the Nazis did, wasn't it?
Yep.
And the fact is, the Nazis were the sort of distracting thing. It was the magician that sort of make the distraction over here so you don't look over here. That's what the Nazis did. And in the 1960s, the Eugenics Society membership was falling, and so they decided upon a policy of crypto-eugenics, in other words, secret eugenics. That's their term, not mine. And basically, they keep it going today. They shape-shift, they change their clothes, and they make it in line with the times. But they're still going, and yeah, they're people who want to organized society. And if your face doesn't fit, and this would fit in with your research, that you're doing on tracking babies, they always have a sort of thing of, this is going to improve our lives. They always promise the workers paradise, but they never tell you actually what it's behind is, what the consequences are of that.
So what do you see as the new face of eugenics? The
face of eugenics, as far as publicized, there was a big pushback against University College London because Sir Francis Galton, when he died in 1911, bequeathed 45,000 to London University to support the eugenics chair. And when it became on the nose and everything, well, all of a sudden people realized they're still receiving money from that bequest. So what University College London do is they say, oh, terrible, terrible, we need to distance ourselves from these people. And so they cancel the Galton Lecture Theatre and they cancel the Pearson Lecture Theatre, and they sort of thrash themselves, with rushes and stuff like that and go into repentance. But the fact of the matter is they've still got the Rockefeller Center for, I don't know what it's called, but it's the Rockefeller building at London University, and guess what the Rockefellers were into? The other face of eugenics is the people who, I haven't got any names and specifics, but basically the idea here is that you have an oligarchical family. It doesn't have to be the oligarch, it can be anybody actually. Or actually this was advanced by Toby Young. Toby Young, the British journalist, he writes for The Spectator, he runs the Free Speech Union. Well, he wrote an article in The Quadrant, and he said that one of the ways you could level up society's inequalities was that intelligence is largely inherited. And he said so you have your oligarchical family, or Toby Young's disadvantaged poor family, and what you do is you say, okay, sex is for recreation, reproduction, we're going to do that by IVF.
Yep.
We're going to produce 100 fertilized cells. And I don't think they have the technology, but what we're going to do is examine all of those. And of that 100, see which one is going to be the absolute at the end of the bell curve, you know, the person with a very high IQ, you know, tall, blonde haired, blue eyes, perfect Aryan specimen.
Tell that from an embryo.
Yeah.
They
Now, I
can.
don't think they've got that technology yet, but they're working on it.
Well, there's one outfit called Orchid something, and she's professing, the woman who owns that, to be able to do something similar and to be able to choose the embryo that's the best in the in a particular eugenic sort of form. And then I have noticed that, like I was reading about Elon Musk the other day, he's got, I think, up to about 11 children, and quite a few of them are born through created through IVF.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and then I was reading about the founder of Telegram. I can't remember his name right this second, but he's donated. He thinks he's had about, through his sperm donations, about 100 children.
Yeah, and Jeffrey Epstein too had that sort of scheme going. And the complete wacko was a fellow who, I shouldn't laugh. I have actually, with eugenics, you have to laugh, otherwise you start to cry. It's so horrible. But this guy was running an IVF clinic, and the people who were being inseminated might have wondered why, you know, their little bub looked like the guy who was, and I think he fathered 30,000 children. And so these people are complete whackers.
Yeah, they really are. Because so in my Democracy 2.0, Capitalism 2.0 video I did include in there a Gen V project, because there is, you know, there's a lot of plans to CRISPR and genetically alter babies in utero and to understand genetic links between parents down to children and intervene through CRISPRing.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's a ABC series on the radio, a radio series that's actually really good and does get to the 4th episode, does track eugenics in Australia. So there was the Eugenics Society of Victoria, and one of the members became sort of headed up the precursor to the CSIRO, which is not a surprise at all, because the CSIRO is completely obsessed with synthetic biology and genetic interference. But then you've got Gen V project, which is really new in Victoria, tracking all babies born over a 2-year period, taking the DNA from mothers and fathers and babies, and then tracking these children as well as the parents, their health outcomes, their academic capacities, their social skills, you know, everything else. And then those DNA samples are stored and then can be used for any projects, potential research projects. So there is.
Sorry to interrupt you to say, I wasn't even aware of that until you drew my attention to it through your articles.
Yeah. So this is like this sort of eugenics, you know, what's going on here. And then the Wellcome Trust.
Yes.
You know, which Julia Gillard heads up.
I do know that they're measuring development at certain ages.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's a eugenics spin to that as well. There's moonshots from Bayer Monsanto where they talk about genetically altering the human body so you don't get disease anymore. And, you know, and then there's eugenics sort of discussions around mental health.
Yeah.
And whether or not you can intervene and change, you know, CRISPR or do interventions.
And then you've got Norval Harari at the WEF, you know, that, what was the book, Sapiens, he wrote. And he's giving speeches sort of saying, well, people are surplus to requirements. And, you know, there's no space in the world for you. I'm just going to quote Chesterton. Chesterton, in his Eugenics and Other Evils, and I'm reading this, he talked about the modern craze for scientific officialism and strict social organization. And it's like, well, yeah, it's inconvenient that people are stupid or this, that, and the other, you know. I know a hell of a lot of people myself, and, you know, but then, and its fact is, but they seem to think that they're going to be the ones ruling.
Yes.
Dr. Southerland, in a 1926 book, he says they all envisage that they're going to be around the committing table deciding who's going to get knocked on the head or who's not. And he says that they get very angry with him when he says, actually, do you think that if you go and knock people on the head, they might fight you back? And they're like, oh, that's a terrible thing. And he said, well, but that's the side. I mean, the arrogance of Harari to say, you know, we're just giving computer games and drugs, and that's when he's trying to sell it to you.
Mm.
So imagine what it's going to be like actually when we've got you there.
And when people aren't really needed, you know, with the machine learning and the AI and the, yeah, it's very concerning. Have you got that quote handy that you sent me, which is about eugenicists love the long sentence?
I don't, I'm afraid, but in essence, and this is my pathetic attempt to be as eloquent as Chesterton, but effectively he talks in stuffy terms about the longevity of people, you know, and they're using up resources and all of this, which precipitates a decision to do X, Y, and Z. And so he says, okay, in interpreting what you just said, you're saying kill your mother. And they go, oh, that's terrible. And he said, well, that's what you just said. And he said, they love the stuffy language. They love all the scientific stuff. But when you take it through to its logical conclusion, they say, oh, well, we didn't mean that. And if you, pardon my German pronunciation, but there was a book by Germans or Swiss Germans called On Life Unworthy of Life. By Binding and Hosch, written in the 1920s, I think. And they were talking from a medical and legal point of view of people who were so defective that they didn't deserve to live. And then after the war, you know, the Nazis saw this and said, yeah, this makes a bit of sense to us, let's do it. And they did the T4 eugenics program. And then after the war, Binding and Hosch saying, oh, it was just an academic paper, you know, we didn't mean it to happen. It's like, well, yeah. You know, it's like, here's the design of a gun. Here's how you manufacture and then you find out somebody shot somebody with your invention. Well, you have a bit of culpability. In the early 2000s, 2006, 2012, something like that, you can look on the British Medical Journal. There's an article called Post-Birth Abortion. And I hope I'm too old to qualify for this. But post-birth abortion, it says, why should the baby live? You know, like if you could kill it yesterday, why not today or the day following or whatever like that? And they go through and justify it. And there's outrage about it and they get criticized and they go, well, we didn't mean it like that. It was just a thought experiment.
Yeah.
And it always is. It always is. It's a thought experiment. It's science. It's promising this brave new world. But when it comes down to it, and when you start to other people, and we saw enough of that during COVID with, you know, the people who wouldn't take the vaccine, they just, you know, I read people disgust me and all of that stuff.
Yep.
It becomes easy to kill them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The things that were said were basically, you know, I mean, Chomsky said, you know, people who aren't vaccinated should be put in a room and not delivered any food, which is wishing death on people. There's and there was a lot of variations on that theme of wishing people to die. And it was very shocking to me that could happen so easily.
And the thing is, look, you know, the thing is about it is that when you use language to denigrate people, you know, I've been in the army. As soon as you go to war with this bunch of people, they get labeled the Hun. In the Falklands War, it was the Pedros and all of this. You label them and it makes it easier to turn them into the enemy. With the language they were using, it does that. And I believe that the people, what I found really, really concerning is that they think they live outside history. They don't look at what happened in the 1930s, for example, and say, oh, well, I, you know, better recognize the sign. They genuinely think somebody's going to come along and he's going to have a little toothbrush mustache and some helpful little horns on his head, and you go, oh, he's evil, I'm never going to follow him. It's not. You know, there's the cliche of the banality of evil, but it's going to get to the stage where you are killing these people or preventing them from eating, and you are being conditioned to harden your heart. So when they're crying and pleading for food, no, I'm doing something that's righteous.
I'm doing something good.
They don't realize that it doesn't actually take evil to kill people. It doesn't take a feeling of evil to kill people.
No,
And
I didn't know that before. I didn't know that before the last few years. That was really one of the most shocking, painful.
That was really scary. Yeah.
And just, you know, like you always think, what would it be like to be, to be around in Hitler's era and what would I have done and whatever else. And you think it's going to be, and then you just watch people just support the most horrendous things and wish death on others. And it was such an awful wake-up call, an awful one.
I think most people would comply. And truthfully, I hope I won't. And I think, and I say that because I think you need that constant looking at yourself. I feel strongly about this, and you need to look at yourself so that you can say, well, is this right? Is that wrong?
Yeah.
Because if you think, I wouldn't do it, and you're secure in that knowledge, that's often what's going to trip you up. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to talk about, and not just talk about the book, but to publicize the story. I want to get to the stage where somebody says, oh, Marie Stopes did this, and somebody will say, actually, that's not right. And instead of them saying, oh, Mark Sutherland, this nobody's heard of historian who isn't, they'll say, no, and I looked in this book, here's the letter in which it says this and that. That's what I wanted. And I'd love people to become more vigilant for that as a result. And I also like, if the people want to read more about the book, it's at exterminatingpovertybook.com, or Dr. Halliday Southerland. And he was a best-selling author who wrote lots of great stories, who exposed a lot of the stuff that was going on about the Magdalene laundries. Then have a look at hallidaysutherland.com to read more about that. But in case you're finishing up, I'd like, before you go, to thank you for your work, because your work on the consolidation of the metropolitan areas was something I just wasn't aware of at all. And I picked up your work on Substack, and it's quite a crowded area. And people, sort of, what am I going to write about? I'm going to write about COVID. You've picked a theme and areas that I haven't heard about, which was, about Vic Health's monitoring of health and also the consolidation of cities. So thank you for the work that you do on it.
No, pleasure. And I wanted to say, your book is very even-handed. You've gone to great pains that, though this is your grandfather you're talking about, that you're even-handed in your approach. So it's very essential that history, even living through the last few years, I've become painfully aware of how history is very much thwarted or spun a certain way. And I think it's incredibly important that the real history gets documented. So, thank you for your book, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. And without it, it just dredges up a whole arena that people need to be aware of now. So thank you.
Thank you.
About death and glory, I feel tired and alone. Try to keep my heart warm and free, but my soul